On a September morning in 1957, Sheldon Roberts drove his family station wagon through the streets of Mountain View, California, picking up 7 other men along the way. Packed tightly inside, the group sat shoulder to shoulder, all of them between the ages of 27 and 32, heading toward the cliffs to do something almost unheard of among American scientists at the time. They were about to walk away from a Nobel Prize-winning mentor and set out to create a company entirely of their own. At the cliffs, 2 young investment bankers, Arthur Rock and Bud Coyle, were already waiting. Robert Noyce, the final member of the group to be convinced, stood before them and spoke for nearly an hour about silicon semiconductors, devices built from sand and delicate strands of wire. They could be produced so cheaply they might one day be thrown away, yet made small and powerful enough to transform the very foundation of every machine in America. When he finished, Arthur Rock reached into his pocket and pulled out 10 $1 bills. Every one of the 10 people in the room signed their name on each bill, marking the beginning of something that would change technology forever. Those 10 signed dollar bills became the unofficial founding documents of Fairchild Semiconductor. That station wagon ride was the first step on a journey that would eventually create what the world now knows as Silicon Valley. But to understand why those 8 men climbed into that car and walked away, you first have to understand the man they were leaving behind. You are watching the history of American electronics and tech, where we break down the companies that shaped the digital age, tracing everything back to the circuits, machines, and engineers who made it possible. This story begins with 10 simple dollar bills and ends with a $2 trillion legacy that completely reshaped the technology landscape. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe and hit the like button, because the rise of this company is every bit as unbelievable as the events that followed. William Shockley was considered one of the greatest scientific minds in America, yet he became known as one of the most difficult leaders to work under. In 1956, he received the Nobel Prize in Physics for his role in co-inventing the transistor at Bell Labs. That same year, he established Shockley Semiconductor Laboratory in Mountain View, bringing in some of the brightest young PhD graduates from across the country. He promised them a chance to explore the unexplored frontier of solid-state physics. Instead, they found a workplace built on distrust, control, and constant interference. Shockley responded to missing equipment by ordering his employees to take lie detector tests. He pushed forward with a 4-layer diode project that many of his own researchers believed was a technological dead end, and he refused to let them develop the silicon transistors they were convinced the industry actually needed. Robert Noyce came from Grinnell, Iowa, the son of a minister armed with a physics doctorate from MIT and a confidence that seemed to shift the atmosphere whenever he entered a room. Gordon Moore was the opposite, a thoughtful, reserved chemist who carefully considered every word before speaking. Jan Herney was a Swiss-born physicist with an idea tucked away in his notebook, a concept Shockley refused to allow him to pursue. They had arrived because of the Nobel laureate. They stayed because of one another, and when Shockley finally made the situation impossible to endure, they chose to walk away together. Eugene Kleiner reached out to his father's financial connections in New York, sending a letter that eventually landed at Hayden Stone and Company. When Arthur Rock read it, he recognized an opportunity that everyone else on Wall Street had overlooked. 8 brilliant scientists who were far more valuable together than they were apart. Rock's associate, Bud Coyle, helped connect the group with Sherman Fairchild, the industrialist behind Fairchild Camera and Instrument. Each of the 8 founders invested $500 of their own money, while Fairchild provided a $1.38 million loan to launch the company. On September 18, 1957, they walked away from Shockley Semiconductor and established their new company at 844 East Charleston Road, right on the boundary between Palo Alto and Mountain View, only 12 blocks from the laboratory they had abandoned. Shockley viewed their departure as a personal betrayal. It remains uncertain whether he was the one who first called them the Traitorous Eight, or if the name came later, but the label endured. Over time, history would transform what was meant as an insult into a symbol of innovation and rebellion. 3 research teams took shape under the direction of Moore, Herney, and Last, with each group following a different strategy for producing silicon transistors on a large scale. They began their experiments in Victor Greenwich's garage before relocating to the building at 844 Charleston Road. Moore's method delivered the strongest results, and by the summer of 1958, Fairchild released its first commercial product, the 2N697 silicon Mesa transistor. The first 100 units were sold to IBM for $150 each, a price nearly 30 times higher than a germanium transistor where they were used in the onboard computer of the B-70 bomber. More orders soon followed, with shipments going to Autonetics for the guidance system of the Minuteman ballistic missile. For a company that was only just getting started, these were not ordinary customers. They were some of the most important names in American technology and defense. But the Mesa transistor had a hidden weakness that threatened to destroy everything they had built. Microscopic particles breaking loose inside the metal package could create shorts across the exposed silicon junctions, causing the devices to fail. By the end of 1958, with the crucial Minuteman contract on the line, reliability had become a matter of survival for the young company. The breakthrough would not come from Noyce or Moore. It would come from the quietest physicist in the room, a man whose contribution would change the future of electronics, yet whose name remains unknown to most people. Jean Herney had drawn the core idea in his notebook on December 1, 1957, just 2 months after Fairchild's creation, rather than stripping away the silicon oxide layer after the masking process. As standard methods required, he suggested keeping it intact to protect the fragile junctions underneath. The rest of the industry believed the oxide layer would capture impurities and ruin the device. Herney believed the exact opposite. In January 1959, Herney submitted his patent disclosure, and just a few months later, by March, he had created a working device. He named it the planar process, referring to the flat, smooth surface of the completed transistor. Decades later, one historian would describe it as the single most significant breakthrough in the entire history of the semiconductor industry. The 2N1613 planar transistor entered the commercial market in April 1960. It solved Fairchild's reliability problems, secured qualification for the Minuteman program, and gave the company a powerful advantage in high-reliability applications for years to come. Then Noyce took Herney's breakthrough and pushed it even further. If the oxide layer could protect a single transistor, why not place multiple components onto one piece of silicon and link them together with deposited aluminum connections? In July 1959, Noyce filed his patent for the integrated circuit. By the end of 1960, J. Last's team had built the first working planar integrated circuit. Fairchild now possessed 2 revolutionary inventions that would become the foundation of nearly every semiconductor chip manufactured around the world for the next 6 decades. Yet Herney never became a household name. When Jack Kilby of Texas Instruments received the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2000 for the invention of the integrated circuit, Noyce had already passed away, and Herney's crucial role in making that technology practical was not recognized. There are 2 ways to view that omission, and both deserve consideration. The Nobel Prize often rewards theoretical originality, and Kilby's demonstration did come first, but the person who made large-scale semiconductor production possible remained outside the spotlight because his contribution was seen as engineering rather than fundamental physics. The Cold War created the demand that accelerated the industry. In 1962, NASA chose Fairchild's micrologic integrated circuits for the Apollo guidance computer, a system designed by MIT and built by Raytheon, using approximately 5,000 Fairchild chips that cost between $20 and $30 each. By the middle of the 1960s, NASA was purchasing nearly 60% of all integrated circuits produced in the United States. The government did not create the technology, but its enormous demand gave manufacturers the volume they needed to scale production. And that increased scale pushed costs lower, opening the door for commercial companies to adopt the technology. In April 1965, Gordon Moore published an observation in Electronics magazine that would become one of the most famous predictions in technology history. He noticed that the number of transistors packed onto an integrated circuit had been increasing at a rapid pace, roughly doubling every year, and he predicted that the pattern would continue. Moore's law was not a rule of nature or a formula written into physics. It was a forecast created at Fairchild, based on the company's own progress and data, but that prediction would become the guiding timeline for the semiconductor industry, shaping innovation and progress for the next half-century. What came next was a level of influence and success that the American electronics industry had rarely witnessed. Fairchild expanded from just 12 employees into a workforce of 12,000 people. Revenue surged from $1.3 million in 1959 to more than $130 million by 1966, making it the second largest semiconductor company in the United States, trailing only Texas Instruments. A Fairchild advertisement from that era featured a collection of Silicon Valley company logos with a bold statement above them. "We started it all." The breakthroughs of that era deserve recognition because the engineers behind them deserve the same. The 2N1613 planar transistor became reliable enough to power both missiles and spacecraft. Fairchild's micrologic NOR gate became a fundamental component of the guidance computer that helped Apollo reach the moon. Bob Widler, who joined the company in 1963, designed the MU-A702 and MU-A709, the world's first monolithic operational amplifiers, giving Fairchild a commanding position in both analog and digital electronics at the same time. Don Forbes, Rex Rice, and Bryant Rogers created the dual inline package in 1964, the small rectangular casing with 2 rows of metal pins that became the standard physical form of integrated circuits for the next 30 years. If you have ever opened a computer made before the mid-1990s, you have likely seen their invention sitting inside, a piece of technology history you could literally hold in your hand. But the wealth created in Palo Alto flowed back east to Fairchild Camera and Instrument, the parent company based in Syosset, New York. The stock options that might have kept the engineers committed were never offered in a way that truly rewarded them. And the very culture that had produced Fairchild's greatest breakthroughs, the lack of rigid hierarchy, the freedom to share ideas, and the collaboration between teams, taught everyone inside the company the same lesson. If 8 engineers could leave Shockley's laboratory and build something revolutionary, then any talented engineer could leave Fairchild and create the next great innovation. The exodus began much earlier than many histories suggest. Ream Semiconductor broke away in 1959, and by 1961, Jay Last and John Herney had already moved on to create Amelco, with Eugene Kleiner and Robert Noyce following just weeks later. The original 8 had been divided in half before Fairchild had even reached its 5th anniversary. Bob Widler and Dave Talbert left for National Semiconductor in 1965, and by 1967, 5 more senior managers had departed the company. The same year, Fairchild recorded its first financial loss. Sherman Fairchild brought in C. Lester Hogan from Motorola to serve as CEO. Hogan arrived with nearly 100 Motorola managers, replacing much of the existing leadership and effectively dismantling the culture that had made Fairchild unique almost overnight. In March 1968, Gordon Moore and Robert Noyce, the final 2 original founders still remaining at Fairchild, reached out to Arthur Rock once again. That summer, they launched a new company called NM Electronics, which would soon be renamed Intel. Andrew Grove joined them, along with Federico Fagan, who brought the MOS silicon gate technology he had developed while working inside Fairchild's own research laboratories. It was an innovation Fairchild had failed to move quickly enough on. At Intel, Fagan would use that technology to create the world's first commercial microprocessor. Fairchild created the planar process. Fairchild created the monolithic integrated circuit. Fairchild created the package that made those chips practical, and then Fairchild watched the very engineers behind those breakthroughs walk out the door, taking those ideas with them and building the future somewhere else. The remains of Fairchild changed ownership repeatedly over the following decades. In 1979, Schlumberger, the French oil field services company, acquired Fairchild, believing its semiconductor expertise could strengthen the company's main business. It never delivered the results they hoped for. In 1987, Schlumberger attempted to sell Fairchild to Japan's Fujitsu, but the U.S. government blocked the agreement over national security concerns. National Semiconductor later purchased what was left of the company. When it also failed to restore Fairchild to profitability, the business was spun off again in 1997, with its headquarters moved to South Portland, Maine, nearly 3,000 miles away from the California valley that carried its legacy. On September 19, 2016, ON Semiconductor finalized its acquisition of Fairchild for $2.4 billion, paying $20 per share. The company's NASDAQ listing was removed, bringing an end to its life as a publicly traded company. A startup that began with a $1.38 million loan, whose employees went on to create Intel, AMD, National Semiconductor, Kleiner Perkins, and Sequoia Capital, was ultimately sold for less than the yearly revenue generated by several of the companies it helped inspire. Robert Noyce, known as the mayor of Silicon Valley, died on June 3, 1990, after suffering a heart attack following his morning swim at his home in Austin, Texas. He was only 62 years old. He never got to witness Intel rise to become the world's largest semiconductor company, nor did he see the full impact of what those 8 men had set in motion when they climbed into that station wagon decades earlier. But Fairchild's true impact was never measured by Fairchild itself. By 2014, researchers estimated that roughly 70% of publicly traded technology companies in the Bay Area could trace their roots back to Fairchild's founders and employees. The Computer History Museum has called it the first trillion-dollar startup, not because Fairchild itself reached that valuation. Its peak worth was only around $2.5 billion, but because the companies that grew from its legacy went on to create more than $2 trillion in combined value. A 1986 industry analysis chart traced 126 semiconductor companies directly back to Fairchild alumni. Eugene Kleiner went on to co-found Kleiner Perkins Caulfield and Byers in 1972, while another Fairchild veteran, Don Valentine, founded Sequoia Capital that same year. Those 2 venture capital firms alone would eventually finance some of the biggest technology companies in history, including Apple, Google, Amazon, and hundreds of others. The planar process that Jan Herney first sketched in his notebook on December 1, 1957, remains the foundation of how nearly every chip in the world is produced today. The building at 844 East Charleston Road is still standing, marked with an IEEE milestone plaque honoring what happened there. Yet most people who pass by the building have no idea that inside those walls, the future of modern technology was created. On a September morning in 1957, 10 men signed their names on 10 $1 bills inside a San Francisco hotel room, and somehow that was enough to begin. There was no established venture capital system, no blueprint for building a startup, and no place known as Silicon Valley yet. Those bills that passed across the table at the Clift Hotel helped fund a company that would create the manufacturing process, the integrated circuit, and the package that shaped the modern electronic world, only to watch nearly every person who built it leave. Fairchild did not disappear because it failed. It spread, and everywhere its people went, they planted the seeds of something new. Think about what that breakup actually created. Intel was born from Fairchild, and Intel went on to develop the microprocessors that placed computers on disks around the world. AMD also traces its roots back to Fairchild, and today its chips power cloud infrastructure, gaming systems, and high-performance computing across the globe. National Semiconductor came from Fairchild. Kleiner Perkins came from Fairchild as well, and that firm would go on to invest in companies like Amazon, Google, Netscape, Genentech, and many others that transformed the way people shop, search for information, communicate, and advance medicine. Sequoia Capital also emerged from the Fairchild network, and it would later back some of the most influential technology companies ever created, including Apple, Cisco, Oracle, YouTube, WhatsApp, and Stripe. Follow that thread far enough, and the connection becomes almost unbelievable. A simple sketch made by a Swiss physicist in a notebook in 1957 leads through an unbroken chain to the smartphone in your hand, the vehicle you drove today, the satellite that helped guide your route, the servers that delivered this video, and the artificial intelligence systems now transforming software in real time. Few companies in American industrial history have ever created that much lasting value while keeping so little of that value for themselves. Fairchild's own peak market value never rose beyond roughly $2.5 billion. Yet the companies that grew from its people and ideas have, by conservative estimates, reached more than $2 trillion in combined value. That enormous gap between what Fairchild captured and what it created represents one of the greatest lessons of the 20th century technology industry. It proves that in a knowledge-driven economy, The most valuable assets leave the building every evening with the people who created them. And if a company gives those minds no reason to stay, they will simply walk out the door and build the next competitor somewhere nearby. The parent company in Syosset never recognized that reality. Sherman Fairchild never recognized it. Schlumberger never recognized it. National Semiconductor never recognized it either. They all believed they were acquiring technology, products, and manufacturing lines. What they truly needed to preserve was the culture that created them. But by the time the deals were signed and the money changed hands, that culture was already gone. It had driven away in another station wagon, opened a new office just 12 blocks away, and started building something new from the ground up. There is a deeper lesson hidden in Fairchild's story, one that goes beyond stock options, leadership mistakes, and corporate decisions. Fairchild showed that in technology, one of the greatest risks is being completely right before the world is ready for it. The company created the right manufacturing process, the right technology, and the right package design within its first 3 years. It controlled its market for almost a decade, but the same intelligence of its engineers, the same culture of freedom, collaboration, and ambition that produced those breakthroughs eventually became the force that pulled the company apart. The men and women who learned how to create inside Fairchild did not lose those abilities when they left. They carried with them the techniques, the instincts, the confidence, and the relationships they had built along the way. Every person who walked out made the next person more willing to do the same, because each new company started by a Fairchild veteran proved that leaving was not the end. It was the beginning. Over time, departure stopped being seen as an act of rebellion and became part of the culture itself. The constant pursuit of building the next great company became Silicon Valley's defining trait, a tradition written into the region's identity by Fairchild's own example. Consider the geography of what happened. Before Fairchild, America's electronics industry was concentrated on the East Coast, around Boston's Route 128 corridor and the industrial regions of New York and New Jersey. Bell Labs operated from Murray Hill. RCA was based in Camden. The greatest research institutions of the post-war era were built along the Atlantic coast. Fairchild did more than create a company in Northern California. It proved that Northern California could become the center of technological innovation. And once the engineers gathered, once the investors arrived, and once the momentum began, the force became impossible to stop. The apricot orchard south of San Francisco transformed into the most valuable concentration of commercial real estate on Earth. And the name Silicon Valley, coined by a journalist in 1971, was not a reference to the land itself, but to the material Fairchild had chosen to build the future around, silicon, at a time when germanium still dominated the industry. One final point deserves to be made clearly. Most of the original 8 founders never became household names. Robert Noyce became famous. Gordon Moore became famous. But the other 6, Herney, Last, Blank, Greenwich, Kleiner, and Roberts, went on to live lives with different levels of success, recognition, and public attention. John Horney, the man whose notebook sketch on December 1, 1957, helped make the modern integrated circuit industry possible, spent his later years supporting education projects in Nepal and Bangladesh, building schools and expanding learning opportunities throughout the Himalayas with the same careful attention to detail he once brought to silicon and oxide layers. He passed away in 1997. Julius Blank, the skilled toolmaker who created the equipment that helped Fairchild begin its first production runs, died in 2011. Victor Greenwich, the electrical engineer whose garage hosted some of the company's earliest experiments, passed away in 2000. These men never received lifetime achievement honors broadcast to millions. They never stood beneath the lights of a stock exchange celebration. They did something far more lasting. They transformed the physical foundation of modern civilization. And remarkably, most of them accomplished it before they had even reached the age of 35. If you ever worked at Fairchild, or at any of the companies that grew from its legacy, if you ever soldered a dual inline package onto a circuit board, or traced a design back to a Fairchild part number, leave a comment below. Tell us the company, the year, and the chip you worked with. If you ever sat at a workbench inside Building 1 on Charleston Road, tested wafers on the production floor in San Rafael, or shipped devices from the South Portland facility after Fairchild had become a forgotten name to most people, your piece of the story still matters. If you were at National Semiconductor when Widler arrived and transformed its analog division, or at Intel when Fagin's silicon gate process helped make the 4004 possible, or at AMD when Jerry Sanders fought to raise the resources needed to challenge the very company that had once been his home, then you are part of this same lineage. If you designed systems using Fairchild op-amps or selected Fairchild transistors for a circuit board that ended up flying on a satellite, operating inside an ambulance, or powering a telephone switching station in a place most people have never heard of, then you helped carry that legacy forward. The engineers who integrated those components, the technicians who tested every device, the sales representatives who drove rental cars to customer locations with datasheets tucked in their briefcases, all of them were part of the network that carried Fairchild's inventions from a notebook in Mountain View into the unseen infrastructure of everyday life. The engineers who created the silicon know this history better than anyone who has ever written about it. Subscribe and follow along as we preserve the story of American electronics, one company at a time. Another chapter in the rise of an American tech giant is coming next, and you won't want to miss how this one unfolds.